Hello. Why don't you? I might, so I would only sit there just like.
Because I was just going to step aside.
Yeah, and so, yeah, and after that, you can sit there. You can watch this thing, and then I'll.
Wonderful. Thank you. Hello, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jim Anaya. I'm the Dean of the University of Colorado Law School. And today it's my pleasure and honor to welcome back to Colorado Law one of our own, a lawyer who has dedicated his entire life to civil rights and who played a significant role in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. James P. Turner served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General, the senior career lawyer in the Justice Department Civil Rights Division for 25 years under 7 consecutive presidents. A 1952 graduate of the University of Missouri Journalism School, Mr. Turner served in the Marine Corps in Japan and Korea before completing law school here at the University of Colorado, graduating with the class of 1957. That same year, he joined the United States Justice Department. Returning to Colorado law to Colorado, not the law school, but to Colorado in 1961, he stayed in private practice until early 1965, when he was hired by the legendary Director John Doerr to help enforce the new Civil Rights Act. He coordinated the division's support at the unsuccessful Alabama state murder trials of the Klansmen who killed civil rights volunteer Viola Liuzzo in 1965. He went on to assist door in the federal conspiracy prosecution related to that same murder, which resulted in the first conviction of Klansmen in a death case in modern Southern history. Mr. Turner played leadership roles in the division's activities ranging from the Kent State grand jury proceedings and the Rodney King police misconduct trial to voting rights cases and reparations for Japanese American attorneys. He personally presented oral arguments before the United States Supreme Court on 4 occasions and was nominated by Democrat President Carter for a Presidential Distinguished Service Award, and was later presented, and that same award was presented later by President Reagan. A lifelong civil rights advocate, Mr. Turner first publicly condemned racial bigotry in a 1946 oration before the National Forensic League. Since retiring in 1994, he has written on civil rights issues in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and other publications. He is also the author of 2 books, The Other Side of the Mountain, an autobiography, and Selma and the Luiso Murder Trials, the first modern civil rights convictions, published by University of Michigan Press. And following today's talks, you'll be able to purchase copies of the book outside of the courtroom. Joining Mr. Turner is his spouse, Anita Stevenson, who will engage in a conversation with Mr. Turner around his experiences and the book. Welcome, Anita, Ms. Stevenson, and Mr. Turner. It's wonderful to have you back here at the University of Colorado Law School.
Thank you very much.
Please join me in welcoming Mr. Turner.
Am I turned on now? We were having this thing about how to make sure the microphone got turned on. I don't do this very often, so it's a kind of a new thing for me. The dean introduced me briefly, but let me just vaguely. As you may have heard, my name is a different last name, and my husband and I have been married for over 40 years now. And for most of those 40 years, I have heard him routinely, when he introduces me, say, "She refuses to use my name." At that time when you did that kind of thing, and I've always been there. So that's the difference in the names kind of thing. From the time I grew up in Utah, just briefly, I'm also a lawyer, but by going to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, where I met him, is when I went back to law school and got my law degree. Wanted to say a couple of things. When just before we got married, he took me on a trip through the South to see many of the sites that are talked about in this book and the sites of the trials and the things that had gone on. Being from Utah, it was like girl from Utah comes to DC and the Justice Department and is never quite the same again. It was an eye-opening experience. And it also was from that time on, he has always talked about wanting to write the story of the murder trial of Liuzzo and what went on in that first Klan conviction. So this is essentially what the background to that is. I'm going to, in a minute, start some slides on here just to kind of give you the mood and the idea. A lot of them are pictures that are contained in the book. Some of them are a few additional ones. But it'll just kind of give you a forefront of what we're talking about and what the book was about and the trials were about at that time. Housekeeping things. There's always the books, and you're finally getting your book published and you're selling it. So there are books out there, and I will probably go out as quickly as we can at the end for anyone who wants to buy the book. As I was joking, and I dated myself by saying, the books are $20, so I said it's like a yuppie food stamp, because that was my first experience with ATMs when some of you may remember they used to always say, I've got to go get some yuppie food stamps and get your $20 bills out of the ATM machine. So essentially that's it. Because of the circumstances, you'll see you can either buy it by cash and he's here to sign them, or you can go to the University of Michigan site later or Amazon or whatever and order them that way. So with that preface, I'll keep them not up too long, but you'll get a chance to read the little bylines on them and get an idea of what is in the book and the pictures, and then I'll be asking some questions that he can add details to, and then we'll have time, hopefully, for the audience to also answer questions. Now, all I have to do is make sure I do the right thing here. And you'll have a chance to read a little bit of the bylines and just, for me, it's kind of like, it's a little bit of a meditation thing. You get to see some of the actual photos that were taken during that time. Amelia Boynton, you can see them standing over her as there's one of the beaten in the march. There's John Lewis, who, as those of you who may have looked at the book, also wrote a very nice endorsement and praise of my husband's book. This is the final march after numerous trials, of course. Martin Luther King, of course. And that's the victim of the murder, of course. Picture on the front of the book. But you can see that's when Viola Liuzzo was shot, and you can see the blood-stained car and the blood-stained seats there from her murder. This was the Klan counsel, Matt Murphy, who actually launched the defense in the state trials. He only has 2 fingers on his right hand, and he would use that, so he used that, but he also used it for the V for Victory sign that the Klan was going to win this. But he had some accident, which okay. That was the black man who was in the car with her when she was killed. The FBI informant who helped crack the case. And that was the prime assailant convicted in federal court, finally. When Roe had to testify before the Intelligence Committee about it, about undercover and stuff, he was scared enough for his life, he decided to wear something over his head to protect his being identified after he got in the program. And that is the author, my husband, with Jesse Jackson at the 25th anniversary. Actually, I was privileged enough to be with them at that 25th anniversary. Later, he went down with the 50th anniversary with his son, who has occasionally assisted him on some of these things, so memorizing the anniversary of that. And then this was the last one, that was son where Obama and everyone went down to celebrate it all. At the beginning, which we'll leave on. So,
let me move over here a little bit.
You'd rather move over there so you can hear me better? Okay. So we're going to do a little bit of me proposing questions or topics and letting him talk and come back to various things, and then we'll open up to the audience. So I'll start with one of the things we've talked about, which is that you grew up in Pueblo, you went to the University of Colorado Law School, and the question is, how did you get to the Justice Department, to this case, and why did you stay for so long?
Well, I grew up in Pueblo, and there's nobody in my family ever went to college, but college had a bigger attraction then. It was growing all the time with the GI Bill and everything, so more people wanted to go, certainly, and actually, I was supposed to go to the Pueblo Junior College because my family had no money. And that's the only thing they could afford. But a Navy recruiter came to town and he said, if you can pass a test, you can go to any of 52 colleges across the country, from Harvard to USC, UCLA, 52 big colleges. And we'll pay you $50 a month. We'll give you a commission when you graduate. You only spend 4 years with us, and then we get 3-4 years of you as a commissioned officer, either in the Marine Corps or the Navy. So sure, I'll try that. Did pass the test and decided, since they only pay for 4 years, I had to choose something besides law because you can't get through law school from high school in 4 years. So I chose journalism because I kind of liked journalism. I didn't really want to do it, but then I looked at journalism schools, and University of Missouri was the best one, fairly close to us. So I went there, and that's where I learned journalism. And when I got out of there, I went to the Marine Corps. We got out of there, went to Japan and Korea. Got out of there, went right to law school at the University of Colorado, and got out in 2.5 years then. I went summer times and everything else so that we didn't want to waste a lot of time. I had 2 kids by then. So that was how I got started, and then the where to go to work at the end. I couldn't find a job. I was interviewed by Whizzer White in Denver, and he said, "Don't call us, we'll call you." And so that was it. So I didn't know what else to do. And then I noticed that somebody from the Justice Department was coming to interview for something called the Attorney General's Honor Program. And that was the second year they offered it. And if you had pretty good grades, which I kind of did, although they were not as good as they started out. Anyway, I qualified and was offered a job there, and got in the car and went off to Washington without even knowing if I passed the bar. I wanted to do what the lawyers in the Roosevelt years had done. They work all night and all that.
That's where you are, huh?
Where I was and where I stayed.
And why did you stay so long?
Well, I liked what I was doing, and at first I was in the tax division, which I kind of liked because I got right away into a big Supreme Court case and got to be admitted to the bar and all that to the Supreme Court. So that was interesting, but I came back to Colorado briefly, practiced for about 4 years, from 61 to 65, and then I wasn't making it. I was having a good time in private practice, but I wasn't making enough money to live on. I had now 3 kids. I was making good money in the Justice Department, and they said I could come back if I wanted to. So I called them up and said I'd go back. And when I was in high school, I wrote a oration, which was won some prizes about prejudice and that kind of thing. So I wound up in the Civil Rights Division and stayed there for the next almost 30 years.
Pretty close. Okay, I wanted to turn the attention to the beginning of the Civil Rights Division, since we were talking about that, and start with the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Can you tell briefly, or sort of briefly, what happened and how what happened in 1957 and how we finally got the Civil Rights Division formed in the Department of Justice?
Yeah, there was no Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice, although today that sounds crazy. That was it. And Congress considered a broad spectrum civil rights law in 1957. Lyndon Johnson was the chief of the senators, and he introduced a bill that would have covered a lot of things that later on were covered: employment, housing, all these things. But then there was this thing called a filibuster that got in the way. And one Southern Senator, Strom Thurmond, South Carolina, I think, set a 24-hour plus. He held the record and defeated pretty much everything that Johnson was trying to do in the 57 Act, except for one thing. Well, two things. One, they left in something about voting rights, and then they left in another thing that said, in the Department of Justice, they're going to create a new division, civil rights. And apparently the filibusterers didn't focus on that because that went through. And they were started with 15 lawyers from the criminal division, civil rights section, and that 15 has now grown to over 400 lawyers and 300 helpers who enforce other aspects, things like, other aspects of the
You'd be too long to list them all. Public
I can't list
accommodation,
them all.
special lit.
But anyway, that's where they made up of 15 lawyers, and in the early 60s, Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General, and he called the people from the division in and said, "What are we going to do?" And they described to him all of the voting rights problems that were in the South and all the other kinds of problems. Said, how can we possibly do much? We haven't got but a handful of people. And he said, get out the road maps and go. So that's what they did.
And what they've done ever since, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
All right, let me turn your attention to 1965. We're getting there, and it's February, and you have just come on board in the Civil Rights Division. And at that time, how did that lead to your participation in this Liuzzo murder trial?
Well, the 1964 Act was passed, and it did contain all of the other types of things that they wanted addressed. So I was hired to help enforce the 64 Act, and the division was then divided up geographically, and they had 4 sections. Southeastern was the 2 Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama, and the southwestern was Mississippi and Louisiana. I was assigned to Mississippi and Louisiana, and we had maybe there were 15 or 20 lawyers there, and that's all we had, to take care of 2 states and all of these issues. Then while that was going on, Dr. King started a program in Selma, and they said they were going to get the right to vote come hell or high water, and every day they would go to have a march to the registrar's office, and every day Sheriff Clark would chase them all back to the churches. And that was what was going on then. And
So you're
And
there, and what's your first assignment? How does that work?
The first assignment I got was to come to Selma to help them, because on the 5th day of the march to Montgomery, Viola Liuzzo was shot and killed, and there were 4 Klansmen in a car that shot and killed her. One of them was a FBI informant. And the next day, the president was able to announce who did the shooting and why, and we then got indicted the Klansmen, 3 Klansmen in the car, for violating federal law. But then the state came and said that they wanted to try it first because they could get a capital offense, and they were going to get a conviction and all this stuff. And nobody could quite believe that, but the state attorney general and the governor swore that that's what they were going to do, and we had to allow them to try. I was assigned to come to Alabama and to go to the trials, to turn over all of the states, all of the federal evidence that we had collected, and go to the trials.
Okay, but it
Twice.
didn't happen quite that easily. Personal experience, as I recall, you were not exactly very happy because you were left in Washington for a period of time while everybody was down there twiddling your thumbs, wanting to get down there on your first assignment. Want to tell people here a little bit what that was about, what happened when you got there?
I called John Doerr every day and said, "Is today the day I can come?" And they, no. And then when Mrs. Liuzzo was killed, he called me and said, "Come down," without telling me why. And I got there, and he went around to the room and said, "This phone is to the White House, this one's to the Justice Department, this one goes this and nowhere, this and that," and took me around, and introduced me to the FBI guy, and then he said, "You're in charge. We've got to get back and get the FBI started on the investigation of the murder, and I need somebody here. Call me every 2 hours." And that was my job for the while.
That was when there were no cell phones. You had to run to find a payphone, right? Someone to call every 2 hours. I also, having explained, recall you at least describing before and to me about having to drive between Selma and Montgomery, and your feeling about driving down that road.
I was worried about it. He said, "Why don't you drive over to Selma, and I want you to see what's going on over there." And I said, "Well, maybe the marshals, you mean that I should ride with the marshals or the FBI?" He said, "No, they're tired from all this marching. You drive on over there in a rental car." So I drove over there thinking of the whole way of what they did to the last car that went that way, but nobody bothered me. We never had any problem that way.
Okay, I'm going to read just a scene from the book, give you your voice for it, about described in the book. There was death in the warm Alabama air in March of 1965. A cowardly, random, and senseless political execution was about to take place on Route 80. Twisted minds had conceived this as an act of terrorism so dramatic that it would make the country reverse its national civil rights policy. In a wild scene out of the post-Reconstruction South, by shooting a defenseless woman in the head out on a dark and lonely highway, the Ku Klux Klan was hoping to kill the nation's awakening commitment to racial justice. Instead, in the actual world, this highly publicized murder would become the final straw that made the case for federal action inevitable and irreversible. Which leads me to the question that you touched a little bit on, but why in the world would the Justice Department step back and let the state of Alabama proceed with the trial?
Well, they did that because we'd always said that the basic responsibility for law and order in this country is a state is up to the states. And if they were willing to do it, they would have the laws to do it, and they could go ahead and do it. Federal law sometimes made the same act a federal violation, and so we could sometimes take over if we wanted to. But they came and asked if they could go first, and Mr. Katzenbach, the Attorney General, said they could, although nobody really had a lot of faith that Alabama was going to suddenly reform itself and do all those things.
The federal government hadn't done very many trials at that time anyhow, because this was new laws. Is that correct? Okay. So we know that they asked permission to go first. Let me read another scene out of the book to you, and that's about the trial setting. And then perhaps, or do you want to read that? You got that section there?
You can read it.
Okay. So, on the morning of May 3rd, 1965, in the hamlet of Haneyville, which is pronounced Haneyville, Haykneeville, even though it's not spelled that way, I was goggle-eyed as the big circus came to town. The town's grassy square was dominated by the courthouse, a gleaming white Greek revival building that had stood there since 1856, 5 years before secession. The square teemed with people, curious locals mixing with reporters and many other out-of-towners. The general scene called to mind the set for Inherit the Wind, that wonderful play about what was labeled the monkey trial, the 1925 Scopes case over whether it was legal to teach evolution in Tennessee. The scene raised the question of whether this Alabama antebellum courthouse could produce only antebellum justice. That isn't the end of the quote, but I want to pause to say that that was one of the places that he insisted I see when we went on our trip through Alabama. And I still remember the chills, and to this day, of looking at that courthouse and walking in and actually meeting a few of the people that were still been involved in the trial from the state side. It is quite impressive when you look at it to realize what's going on and what went on. Southern Bell had hastily installed a bank of payphones behind the courthouse for media use. The National Press Corps was out in full strength with TV cameras, radio reporters, and dozens of the pencil press, national and international. Alabama lawmen by the dozen, uniformed and everyone a white male, were there to maintain order. Klan loyalists, who normally had few opportunities to get onto the public stage, were all dressed up in jackets and ties for the occasion. They proudly strutted around the square behind Imperial Wizard Robert Shelton of the United Klans of America, who came from his hometown in Tuscaloosa, just for the Their new celebrities, Klansmen Wilkins, Thomas, and Eaton, walked along with the Wizard and other high but slightly lesser Klan leaders. Grand Dragons and so on. Klansmen Thomas and Eaton were attended by their wives and children, their hyper teenage sons all puffed up, well scrubbed and chasing attention. So, I wanted you to this is the question for you, because I'll let you read a little. This is pretty bad language, but I think we've all heard it. So even though it's bad and offensive, I ask you to read what Matt Murphy had to say when to use to the all-white jury and describe the racist tones and words he used to do that from the book.
As the book sets out, there were open windows in the courtroom because there was no air conditioning, of course, in the antebellum courthouse. And when the time came for oral arguments, it turned out the reporters did not record what arguments were made because that wasn't evidence. So there was never a record made, except that through the open windows, the reporters noticed that they could hear outside in the parking lot, right outside the window, what was going on inside. So one day a big truck came and put a parabolic microphone there, pointed at the windows, and they recorded what went on inside, and it was escaping out through the open windows. Incidentally, the birds would fly in those same windows that were open, but that was the South. So anyway, I'm going to read you. It was probably the worst oral argument I ever heard that came published in Life magazine by recording. Just a bit over 50 years ago. Anyway, and this white woman who got killed, white woman, where is that NAACP card? I thought I'd never see a day when communists and niggers and Jews were flying under the banner of the United Nations flag, not the American flag we fought for. I'm proud to be a white man, and I'm proud that I can stand up on my feet for white supremacy, not the mixing and mongrelization of the races, not Zionists that run that bunch of niggers. The white people are not going to run from them. And when white people join up with them, they become white niggers. Do you know those big black niggers were driven by this woman sitting in the back seat? Niggers. One white woman, and those niggers right there riding through your county. Communists dominate them niggers. Do you know what that nigger Leroy Moton said on the stand? No, yeah, no, like a 10-year-old boy. He should have been saying yes, sir, and no, sir, before that honorable white judge. But the buck hasn't got the sense, the morals, or the decency. I said, now, boy, look down at your feet. Niggers only understand that kind of talk. How many feet away was that car? So he looked down at his feet and he said about 25 feet. Then he said he passed out for 25 minutes, 30 minutes. What's he doing down there all that time in that car with that woman? Then the nigger ran up the road finally, and a truck came by. And he stopped it, and they put the nigger in the truck, and there they were. The rabbi was driving the truck, of course, with a nigger, a white woman, a nigger man, all in there, feet to feet. Integration breaks every moral law God ever wrote. Noah's son was Ham, and he committed adultery and was banished, and his sons were Hamites, and God banished them when they went to Africa, and the only thing they ever built was grass huts. No white woman can ever marry a descendant of Ham. That's God's law, and I don't care what LBJ says about it. So now you know. Now you've heard the ugly, ugly racism that was used to hang this all-white, all-male jury in the first trial in the Liuzzo case. This is some of the reason why when I was writing the book I decided never to capitalize Klan, even though in most books it says you're supposed to. I don't. And it went on to the summer of '65 after that first trial, and they produced even more problems in Hayneville. A local white man shot and killed a visiting divinity student whose name was Jonathan Daniels. He's from New Hampshire, I think. And he was, the guy admitted that he did it, but he said he was trying to save the woman owner of the store from, they went in there to get soda pops, so it was soda pop thievery that he was preventing. Anyway, that's what they said, and he was acquitted right away. And the same day that that murder happened, Klan Defense Counsel, Three-Fingered Matt Murphy, was driving while intoxicated, I think, and was killed in an auto crash. So they got a better, but still pretty bad lawyer for that.
For the second trial? Before the second trial? You
Yeah.
get to that, yeah. So you didn't have him to maybe help your case a little. I'm going to ask you to read something in a minute, but there's a bottle of water there, and I was going to suggest you take a swallow of it so you get your rest of reading. Roy Reed is someone my husband knew, and I'll ask you to tell him a little bit about him in a minute, and I'm going to read something. Roy, if any of you saw the movie Selma, Roy Reed, he was a reporter for the New York Times, and you would see him running to the phone booth to call in stories. And I'll ask Jim to tell you a little bit about him, but I also knew Roy Reed, but not way back when Jim knew Roy Reed, because Roy Reed and Jim were roommates, housemates, and 3 Squares Co-op, which I always say 4 Squares, but back at the University of Missouri, where he got his journalism degree. And he's a wonderful reporter, and he covered a lot of wonderful stories. He died very recently, and he was involved in chiming in about the book and stuff, and a really good friend, but also really, really, really good reporter. They had drifted apart, and they ran into each other again at these trials, and he'll tell you how they encountered each other again. If you feel up to it, you can tell that before I read the thing that Roy published about the trial, or I can read it first.
Well, I think we're running a little short on time, but I met Roy around 1950 when I went off to journalism school. And we were 21 years old, University of Missouri, and shared a 4-person room. And it was a 3 Squares Co-op, so you had to do some work. I like to there's some jobs that were good. I like to peel potatoes. They had a magic potato peeling machine that got scrubbed off most of the potato peels, and you had to just fine tune them. Roy did dishes every day, and on weekends we both mopped the floors. But anyway, we finally got together again, and Roy got out of journalism first and went off to the Air Force, and I got out second and went off to the Marine Corps. And we didn't see each other for 13 years. And when I was in Selma, Dora was taking me around to introduce me to different members of the federal family, as he called them. And I heard a natural, recognizable voice coming out of the FBI office. It was Roy Reed, who was there for the New York Times to interview the people.
Wasn't his Arkansas accent or anything that you recognized, was it?
Well, and he had a deep basso voice too. I knew who it was. Go on.
So you have to get now to the second trial, which was what I introduced this, because that was at the second trial you actually ran into Roy Reed, and he covered the closing arguments and stuff, correct?
Right.
Okay. And so I can read what his account, we've now got a second trial. The first trial, which we probably skipped over, ended up in, unbelievably, a hung jury, not an acquittal, but a hung jury. So there were 3. So the second trial now has to go. And at that point, they brought in they got in a top-notch prosecutor, right, from the state, and they also now had a new defense counsel. And I can read Roy's account of the summary, but maybe you want to tell a little bit about that trial, if you have anything more to add to that before I read his summary of the closing arguments by Flowers.
Well, I think we're taking too much time on this. Roy was a great guy and a good friend of mine and everything, but I don't want to.
Okay, well, let me summarize. When they got Flowers in to do the summary, he wasn't as efficient. And in the book, there's a whole account of Roy Reed's trial of Roy Reed's summary of the closing argument, and Flowers was ripping the book page out of the book if you don't convict, and he wanted to do it from the Bible, but they said, oh, yeah, that'd be really scandalous here, so he pretended it was a Bible and used like a dictionary or something, and tried to supposedly convince the jury to convict. He gave a fiery closing. Roy Reed made an account of it, which you'll see in the book. And at the end of 90 minutes, they acquitted. So it wasn't exactly very effective on the state's parts. So after that, we go into the federal government finally gets their chance to move in. And that's where one of my husband's favorite people, and some names we've probably all heard along the way, John Doerr, got involved. He was now the Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division, and some of you may have heard ultimately he was the one who led the impeachment committee hearings and the impeachment procedure against Nixon at the time on the Hill. So do you want to talk about John Doerr and the method that you guys used and how you got this conviction in the end?
John Doerr's approach at the third and successful Liuzzo trial, his concept was that the division should function like a law firm, where the most senior partners would handle the most significant cases. They were, after all, getting paid the most money. And so he brought that kind of a fresh view, because that was not practiced all over the Justice Department. He put himself in charge and got the highest ranking local official, the United States Attorney, to assist him, and they had one other assistant in the courtroom, and me. I was not at the table, I was there to make notes. And the reason was that in case there was going to be an appeal, before the reporter could transcribe the record, we would have an edge by having my notes to refer to. And the other things that John brought was a preparation approach that was just out of this world. He hired a bunch of female, mostly female, college graduates. He called them research analysts. Nobody knows what they did. What they did was they would review the FBI reports, they would write summaries, they would do this and that all day long, interview witnesses, and then when everybody else was tired, they'd run out and get coffee and drinks and everything like that. So they had a tough time keeping up with the functions in what we call the boiler room. It was headed by a guy named Bob Owen, who was my boss back in the day, back in Washington. And of course, you get that many lawyers and that many research analysts together, there's going to be crossing over and dating and that kind of thing too. She started out as a research analyst. And she became a lawyer, and now she's my wife for 40 years.
And I'm still a lawyer.
So anyway, that's the way it worked. And but we used to joke and say that with what the boiler room team gave to work with inside the courtroom, a high school debater could get just as many convictions as the best lawyer because everything was done. You had a place to check if a witness testified correctly. You had a box to check for every exhibit to be introduced. You had other things like that, so that there was nothing left to do except really argue the case. And that's what John Doerr's approach was. And let me just go on to Judge Johnson while I was there. Judge Johnson was one of the best judges in America. He was the one that said they had to let them march to Montgomery. And he was the one that said if Wallace can't protect the marchers, we got an army, and they can protect the marchers. And so that's what happened. When Judge Johnson instructed the jury, you could hear a pin drop. It was like he was saying, "This is the law." And when the jury reported back that they were not quite done, they couldn't agree, thought they might be deadlocked, he just said, "You haven't begun to negotiate long enough to be deadlocked." And he gave him another lecture, and he said, "No, wait a minute, move that thing over this way because I can't see that juror on the end." And he would lecture him like that with no notes. And anyway.
He was a great judge and a great, between him and there's a scene in Selma, and then I'll go on quickly, where Martin Luther King is leading the march, and it's the actor where they just stop short from going over the bridge and kneel down. And it's because Judge Johnson at that point had not granted an injunction, and then actually granted an injunction against the march at that point. And it was a question of defying Judge Johnson or of just doing something symbolic to say we're still here but we'll go on. And when you see that in the movie, you took a lot of heat for that, but that was the respect for Judge Johnson, because then Judge Johnson ultimately...
Turnaround Tuesday, we called it.
Got it. And that was the one way they were able to then get his order to do it and actually got it all enforced. But if you look at that and you read something, you know that Martin Luther King took a lot of heat from his own people, because why are we turning around now? Because it's unclear whether he shared all of that with them. And not on the research analysts. Research analysts were a great invention of John Doerr, and he brought the women in and he called them research analysts, and it was the forerunner to being a paralegal. We didn't have that then. Legal assistant, they were like the modern Della Street, but they were used, and I don't know why he decided that was a great idea, but that was a big backbone to when they started to bring their cases. And a good many of the paralegals kind of thing ended up, they were not paralegals, they were research analysts. A lot of them ended up becoming lawyers for a period of time. It was a novel way to approach the kind of things. Okay, so you got your breath, because this is the final question as to why this case is so important. Why you ended up staying 30 years, and why do you always say it's the most important case you ever had?
Well, let me say also that Judge Johnson sentenced them fully to 10 years each, which they served. Anyway, the Liuzzo case was important, and why I write the book. December 3rd is the day it came in. It was John Doerr's birthday, the verdict. And it was the first time in modern American history that an Alabama jury had convicted a Klansman for killing in a civil rights case.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is it okay? Questions? She's coming down. And want anything else before we open it up to questions?
No.
Okay, so I think she's coming around. If anybody has questions, you can ask them now.
Did you guys work with Ava DuVernay on the Selma movie at all? Consult, give information?
No, the person who produced the Selma movie, did we work with her at all?
Oh, we saw the movie, but actually I had a bone to pick with the movie, but that's because of too much knowledge. They really held the President Johnson up to some ridicule there in the course of that movie, and I thought that was unfair.
Yeah, he did have a quarrel with that. We had discussions. The movie was really good, but the part on Johnson, I think that was what she got a lot of criticism for, is that Johnson was portrayed as being more anti trying to get the Voting Rights Act and the things than in reality of what went on at that time. Anybody else?
What did you think of Katzenbach's decision to allow the state trials to go forward before the federal trial?
Wait, the state trial. She wants to know what you thought about the decision to let the state go first rather than the federal government go first.
Well, I thought it was a terrible idea, but it wasn't my decision. It was the Attorney General's, and we had made pledges over the years saying that the states had the prime responsibility for law and order, and you know, everybody knew that Alabama couldn't do that. And the state attorney general was running to replace George Wallace as governor, and because he was term limited, but George came up with a better solution. He put his wife in. Somebody who could not sit on a jury in Alabama became its governor.
You can correct me because I may misstate this, but the decision to let states go first continued a little bit throughout division's actions. The Rodney King trial is one example. The Civil Rights Division Justice had a policy that was, if the state wanted to pursue it, they'd let him go first, and you can correct me if I get anything wrong here. And so that's why you had the state trial go first in the Rodney King case, or the federal government go in. And I don't know how it got fine-tuned exactly, but it certainly was a policy. Is that correct? All right. Anybody else?
Thank you all for coming and make your...
Okay, and I will be out there for my book. I turned
And in some ways jarring look back in history. You reminded us of the acute racism that existed at a point in time, and also helped to make us aware that, although not expressed in the same words today, at least not as frequently, and by public officials and the way you depicted racism and attitudes of racism do continue today, and we are committed to continue to fight and combat those. So thank you for your work, the example of your life and the inspiration.
Thank you for giving it to me.
Thank you.